Hi, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Bree. Today's video, I want to talk to you about cozy fantasy and cozy sci-fi. I've kind of lumped them together because I don't have too many sci-fi books. Cozy fantasy has gotten a lot more popular recently, and I don't think that the subgenre has been fully fleshed out just because it's kind of a new thing. But I think one of the books that really set off people knowing about this subgenre, it's not that people weren't already writing cozy fantasy, it's just that the cozy fantasy genre hasn't been widely read, and the book that started that off with is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. Since this book came out, there's been a big push for cozy fantasy, which is great because I am a cozy fantasy lover myself, and I've read quite a few. So I think that there are multiple ways you can look at the cozy fantasy genre. So I think that there's cozy in that it evokes a wholesome feeling. There's low stakes, nothing really that bad is going to happen. And then there's more of like the soft fantasy, which might have more death and might have not completely wholesome. Some bad things could occur, but it's the atmosphere and the genre that makes it cozy. And so I think that there are two kind of sides to it. So I'm going to be talking about both, and I'll try to call them out when I'm talking about them so you kind of can decide which one you want to go for. I've primarily read more of the soft fantasy because I think the full cozy, I haven't found as many in that area. So I wanted to give some recommendations of cozy fantasy if you liked Legends and Lattes and looking for more things like that, or if you just want to try it out and you want some recommendations, I have a couple here for you that I think that you could really enjoy. I know that all of these books that I'm recommending I've given really good ratings to, and most of them are in my all-time favorites because cozy fantasy and sci-fi is just a genre that I found really I love. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So let's start by talking about Legends and Lattes. So Legends and Lattes, if you don't know, is a cozy fantasy that is said to be low stakes, high fantasy. Sorry, this is a very shiny book. So this is following Aviv Orc, and she has been in the game for too long. She just wants to be done with fighting, done with adventuring, and just open a cozy coffee shop. So that's what she does, and she hires Tandri, who is a succubus, and there's Thimble, who is a mouse, and he bakes, and then there's also Cal, who is a human, and he helps them build this coffee shop. And it's just a sweet story about running a coffee shop and friendship and things like that. And there is a bit of a plot in here because there are people in the town who want to make Viv pay her dues to the town, and they kind of come around collecting, and so there's some tension there and there's some other things going on. But overall, it's just a quiet story about running a coffee shop, and there's lots about drinking the coffee, creating the pastries in here. I really was craving pastries when I was done reading this. And yeah, it's just a cozy story, and I totally see why everyone loves this because it is such a good story. And I'd highly recommend the audiobook because Travis Baldree is actually an audiobook narrator himself. He has narrated over like 300 books, and he narrates his own book, and it was very well done, and I really highly recommend it. Also, I got my husband to read it, who he reads a lot of epic high fantasy, and he actually really enjoyed it as well. And so I think that it can appeal to a lot of different types of readers, that one. So then I want to talk about the book that really started me on my journey to cozy fantasy, and it's technically a middle grade, but I just think that it embodies that cozy fantasy so well. That's Howl's Moving Castle by Deanna Wynne Jones. This is about our main girl, Sophie, and she one day is turned into an old lady from this witch who comes into the shop, and she flees her home, and she ends up at this moving castle with a wizard named Howl, and he is kind of grumpy, he's kind of a curmudgeon, and she just kind of takes over around his house, cleaning it up and things like that, and it's a very cute story, and I would also highly recommend the film because it's really good. And there's quirky cast of characters. There's like a fireplace that's a demon, and there's another little boy who works in there making like potions and stuff to sell to people. I've reread this at least 3 or 4 times now, and it still holds up every single time I read it. I just love it more and more. It's just the embodiment of cozy, and if you like Miyazaki films, I think that this is like a Miyazaki film in a book because he also made it into a film. So yeah, it has my whole heart. So I'd highly recommend this if you haven't given it a shot. Then if you want Howl's Moving Castle, but YA, Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. This is a standalone book, and the thing about a lot of these cozy fantasies is a lot of them are standalones, and so if you don't like series, I think cozy fantasy is a good genre to try out. But this following our main protagonist, Elizabeth, and she works at a library, and basically this library keeps grimoires, and they keep them, and they have to make sure they don't go bad, because if they go bad, they turn into like giant monsters and wreak havoc all over the place. So one night she wakes up to this attack on their place and this grimoire on their library, and this grimoire comes to life and starts attacking the city, and so she has to go help. But then she is ended up being accused of the crime, and she's whisked away to like the big city, and she gets wrapped up in a mystery, and she finds this unlikely friend, Nathaniel Thorne, and he is a curmudgeon as well. If you see a trend in these books, she is with him, and they have to solve the mystery, and there's again a quirky kind of cast of characters, and I really enjoyed this book. It has a lot of parallels to Howl's Moving Castle, but it is a little bit darker. So this is much more, I think, of the soft fantasy variety, because it's not without some sadness or some heartbreak, but I think it's really worth it, and there wasn't a ton of like violence or anything like that in here. So yes, this is another great book to try out. So here is my cozy sci-fi recommendation, and it's actually going to be a duology, but they're novellas. And if you've been on my channel, you might have heard me talk about these, but it's called A Song for the Wild Built and A Prayer for the Crown Shy, and this is the Monk and Robot duology. I don't know if it's a duology considered. There might be more eventually, but I think it's supposed to be just these two. This is following Dex, who is a tea monk, and they're kind of just unsatisfied with life, and they end up deciding to leave their job and go and train to be a tea monk. They do that for a while, and then they decide that that really isn't fulfilling either, so they decide to go off into the forest and just try to be alone and be with their thoughts. While they're in the forest, they run into a robot named Mosscap, and Mosscap is come back to Earth after the robots have left, after this like mass exodus of robots, and he's coming back because robots want an answer to the question, what do humans need? And this is just a really soft, quiet book exploring a lot about what it means to be human, what do humans need, and it's a lot of philosophical questions being asked, and they discuss a lot with that, and it's just a really sweet, gentle story. And I think the world building in this is really good. The world itself feels so vivid despite being only this long. Becky Chambers has a way of creating this wonderful world and just dropping you into it, and I highly recommend it if you want something a little more philosophical but still soft and very wholesome. I love Dex and Mosscap and their friendship that grows throughout these, and I just highly recommend it. I think I really enjoyed the first one, and I fell in love with the second one. I just feel like the more I was in the story, I just loved it even more. So I would highly recommend reading these together, and you can almost read them like one book because they're not very long at all. So then I have a book I read very recently. It just came out, and it is my new favorite cozy soft fantasy. So this one definitely is that soft fantasy side of things, and that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. I love this book with my whole heart. So this is following Emily Wilde, and she goes to Scotland. No, she goes to Sweden. Why was that so hard for me? She goes to Sweden, and she is finishing her Encyclopedia of Fairies, and she just needs to go there and do her last bit of research. And so this is like her journals as she's there, just documenting her time there. And it's a kind of light academia story because you get a lot of lore about fairies and you get a lot of academic stuff. So there's even like footnotes where she'll say that this piece of literature has actually been refuted and things like that. So it feels a little bit like you're reading from a academic journal, except for it's much more if you're reading like the field notes of someone creating their academic journal. And then there's also Bamblebee, who is another colleague of hers who has come along on this trip, but he is kind of like the opposite to her. So he's very laid back. She's very involved in her work, very determined and just singularly focused on this task. And he is social, he gets along with people, but she kind of sees him as a little bit lazy. They both get on each other's nerves, and their back and forth and their banter is so great because while they get on each other's nerves, they also bring out the best in each other. And they end up getting involved in some fairy business, and it just goes on from there. The reason I call this soft fantasy is because there is some on-page death, and that I don't think could fully classify as the cozy. So that's why I say it's soft fantasy. But for most of the book, it definitely feels like a softer kind of fantasy story. And I just love the dynamic between the characters, and I just love the world that Heather Fawcett has built in this. It's a historical type book too, so it's set in the 1800s, and it's going to be a series, so I can just continue on for as long as I want. I think that this also has like a slow burn type romance, so if you're into that as well, I would highly recommend this one. It's my new favorite. It's up there with my other favorite, which I'm going to talk to you about right now. So my other favorite is House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. This is the second book that really got me into the cozy fantasy genre. I feel like this one is probably well known because a lot of people have picked it up. So it's about Linus, who is a social worker for magical children, and he has to go and check up on these children and make sure that they're getting the right care, but also that they're not harming anyone, because in this world, people without magic believe that magic users are bad and evil. And so in this, he's sent to the most dangerous house in this house on the Cerulean Sea, and it's supposed to have the most dangerous children. So he goes, and it's about just him and getting to know these children and getting to know this house, and it's a lot about self-acceptance and about being who you are and found family. It's so great, and I love all of the characters within these books. They all have my whole heart. This is definitely the cozy fantasy side of things, and I'd highly recommend it if you just want a good, wholesome time. Highly recommend if you haven't picked this up. If you take anything from these videos, I think these two are my top ones that I recommend. But I highly recommend all of them, so, you should really just read all of them. Okay, we have a couple more. The next one is an author I've just really grown to love, and while I'm going to recommend just this book, I would just really probably recommend most of her books, because I've read 2 cozy fantasy or fantasy books from her, and then I've read a horror, and I've liked all of them. So that's T. Fisher. So I have Nettle and Bone because it's the one I own, but I also would recommend Sword Heart as well, which is the other one I've read. So Nettle and Bone is following Mara, and she is the 3rd daughter of these people, and her kingdom has to marry this other king so that they can continue. And her sister has married him, and Mara knows that he is a terrible prince, and so she sets off on a mission to kill him. And she finds the switch. She's going to help her. She has to do 3 impossible tasks. And then we're following her journey as this group of people start to come together. They're an unlikely found family group, and how they're going to save her sister and kill this prince. T. Fisher does like quirky characters really well. There's also like usually animal companions. So in this one, there's a dog made out of bones, and there's a demon chicken. I just love the group, the found family elements, and the adventure story that's in here. And it's a novella, so it's really short as well if you're looking for a shorter kind of cozy fantasy. I think it'd be a good one to dip your toes in. This is a soft fantasy. This one is also where there is some death and things like that, but I do think that it's still within that cozy genre because of the atmosphere it creates. Now, Sword Heart, which I'll put a picture up here, is a fantasy romance by T. Fisher, and this is following our main character. I can't remember her name, but her husband dies, and then her family's trying to marry her off to his cousin, and she doesn't want to do it, and she ends up being locked in her room and decides that the only way to get out of it is to kill herself. And she takes a sword and she's like going to plunge it into her heart, and when she unsheaths it, a man pops out named Sarkis, and he decides he's going to save her. And so they go on this huge adventure to basically get her home back. And it's again that unlikely group of characters, and this is definitely a slow burn romance, and it's just funny. The back and forth between Sarkis and our main character is just really good. And yeah, it's again another adventure story, but this one is more heavily romance based. I really enjoyed it. I think if you like romance and you're more of a romance reader, maybe try out Sword Heart instead of Nettle and Bone first. But if you want just a quick, softer fantasy that isn't as heavy on the romance, I would choose Nettle and Bone. But either way, I think T. Kingfisher does quirky cast of characters, found family, and cozy fantasy really well. So I would highly recommend those. I have a couple other of her stuff on my backlist. I just haven't got to them. The last two are kind of romances. The first one is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. This was kind of described like The House in the Cerulean Sea, but I would say this is more romance focused, and this is definitely in that cozy fantasy genre. So we have our main character Mika, and she makes videos on YouTube about being a witch, but no one really knows that she actually is a witch until one day she gets a message saying that they do know she's actually a witch and they want her to come teach these girls at this house. And she goes because witches are not supposed to like mingle, and if there's a lot of power in one area, it can be very dangerous. So she wants to go train these girls to help them control their powers so nothing bad happens. And it's again a found family story, and there's also a love story with the grumpy librarian. So it's a grumpy sunshine romance, which I think most of these are. Yeah, it's a very wholesome story. It's very sweet. I think that it was just not as good for me as House in the Cerulean Sea because I think it focused much more on the romance between Mika and Jamie, which I'm not mad about, but I just had different expectations. I think if you know you like romance and you're looking for a cozy fantasy with romance as like the front, this would be a good one to try. The last one is also a fantasy romance, and I'm enjoying it a lot. That's Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. I am 50% of the way through this, but I can already say I really recommend it. This one so far has been cozy to me fully, but I can't fully say it's not soft fantasy because I haven't finished it yet. It's definitely that like cozy, soft romance. If you like a darker romance or you like a lot of like steamy scenes and stuff, so far this has not been that. It's been a slow, sweet kind of romance story. Again, a grumpy sunshine type thing. This is following our main protagonist, Dora, and she has had a run-in with a fairy, and she basically lost half her soul. She can feel like longer emotions over a longer period of time, but she can't really feel the quick, fast emotions like anger and things like that when a situation occurs. So a lot of times she can get into situations that might be dangerous, but she doesn't really like realize that, or she says things that are like considered improper and she doesn't understand like where she's going wrong. It's a Regency fairy tale, so it's set in London. So she goes with her cousin is going to be debuted to society to find a husband, and she ends up going with her, and they meet this Lord Sorcier, and he's trying to find a cure for this plague that's going on, and he's kind of grumpy. And then we're also like maybe trying to find a cure for her half a soul. And so far I've really enjoyed it. It's got a lot of fantasy elements to it. It's got a fun storyline and a romance, and it's been like a slow, soft fantasy, and I'm really enjoying it. So if you like a romance, this is definitely a romance. People talk about it like very Bridgerton, and I've never watched Bridgerton, so I can't fully say yes to that, but it is definitely a fairy Regency time, and I'm having a good time with it. So I would highly recommend this one if you want a fairy romance. That's a softer fairy romance. So these are the cozy fantasies I have to recommend you. I hope to do a part 2 sometime soon because I do have more that are on my TBR that I want to get through, and I also think I have some that I just didn't mention here. I hope you enjoyed. If you want a part 2, please let me know down below, and if you have any cozy recommendations yourself, please leave them down below so we can all, talk cozy books and find new cozy books. But I think this is a great place to start if you're looking for some more cozy fantasy sci-fi in your life. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and I really thank you for watching. If you want to like this video or subscribe, I'd really appreciate it, and I will see you next time.